Thank you very much, Dr. Farid, for joining us on the podcast, Do Not Talk. This series of podcasts is aimed to develop an intellectual discourse um, for the larger benefit of teachers, parents, and students. Okay, and we are also looking for engagement from all parts of the community members because the topic that we are going to talk is very much relevant to everyone around us. And we are privileged to have Dr. Farid Panjwani on the podcast. Dr. Farid is the Dean of the Institute for Education Development, Aga Khan University, and with all those articles in Dawn and having interacted with you in Islamabad in one of the symposium, um, I really thought that if I could get a chance to talk to you, sir, on curiosity and how important it is, that would be beneficial for a lot of people who would be listening to us. And the best part about digital platform, it stays there for a very long time. Thank you, Dr. Saab. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, sir, we will be talking about a very, you know, uh, important topic, which is about critical thinking. Okay. So, what is critical thinking, and how can you actually, unpack it for people who are not from educational field, and also for people who are in education field also, because teachers, either teachers in university, either teachers in school, okay, and either teachers in middle school. So how important it is for a teacher, for an educator, and for a common man to understand critical thinking.
Okay. Thank you. No, this is a very important, timely question that you have asked. So, to begin with, I think if we look at the everyday use of the word critical,
Yes.
we see that it is used in many different ways. We sometimes say that person was very critical
Yeah.
of some idea or some person. By that, we often mean that he was, um, in some ways, quite negative about that person and was showing the problems with thought or the practice. We also use the word critical sometimes in the sense of importance. It's very critical that this gets done in time, or that's also another way in which we use. Um, in the discourse that we are talking about, educational, academic, being critical again has different ways of understanding because it is an abstract idea
Yeah.
and not a concrete idea
Mhm.
or concrete thing that you can point to and everybody can agree this is what it is. This is a chair. This is a cup. When you have abstract things, uh, you don't get a single definition. So the question really is, what can one mean by critical? And I'll work on that. Now, one way to think about it is to look at its etymology and where it comes from. So it has roots in ancient Greek language where it really means to judge, to give a judgment, to make judgment. And when we are critical, we are giving a judgment about something, isn't it? So, what is this judgment? How to make it? And what are the things about which we are being judgmental? That's what critical thinking is. It's a thinking that leads to judgment about certain things. What does that mean? So first thing is that when you are judging something, you either consciously or unconsciously have certain standards in mind, um, because against those standards, then you judge something. So when a teacher is marking papers, there is often a rubric, or at least in his or her mind, there are certain standards against which the papers are judged. So there is a deep relationship between being critical and having certain standards uh, and certain values against which you judge the thing so that you can critically evaluate it. What are those values or standards against which the judgment can be made? Now, I would propose that there are at least two such ways in which we can think of the standards and values. One is the value of truth, the value of accuracy, the value of authenticity. So when you hear something, when you read something, to be critical would often mean that you make sure you assess whether what is being proposed is true, it is something, if it's historical, whether it is based on certain sources, if it's contemporary, whether the ideas that lead up to it, the conclusions, the logical conclusions that are driven from the premises, whether they are valid or not. So for example, just to give an example to make it concrete, if government says that countries' GNP has increased by 5% in the last 3 years, so one would say, okay, what have been your sources to find that out? What is the methodology? Um, is it something that the government itself has just given, or some independent assessment has been done? You may also check whether the numbers are correct, whether the calculations are correct, whether what needs to be put in that calculation has been put in. Have you left out something? Have you over uh, calculated something? All of those kinds of things. Similarly, newspaper, if you see a heading, you can ask, what are the sources of this claim that has been made? Let's suppose somebody claims that this war was started by X country. So you would say, okay, how do you know? Where did you get this information? What is the evidence for that? So what you are doing is you are using the standards and values of truth and coherence and accuracy to judge. That is being critical of that. And you might, out of that process, you might say, my judgment, my critical thought is that this can stand as it is. Or you might say, no, what it is claiming is too much. It cannot be justified by the sources and by the background. So, Babar, that's one thing. That's one kind of judgment that we make, which is about that. But often that is not enough. Often one has to make another kind of judgment. And that I would call judgments that are to do with equity, fairness, and justice. So let me go back to the example of a government claiming that our GNP has increased by 20% in the last 2 years, last 5 years. Fine. You have established what they are saying is true. It did increase. These are the sources you have. But then you may also wish to ask, who benefited from this 20% growth? Was it equitably distributed among the people? Or was it concentrated on the richest 1% or 5% or 10%? So the number is one thing and the growth is one thing, but how did it get distributed? Because if it did not get distributed in an equitable fashion, what may happen that while the overall number is higher, a particular group may have a more flourishing life, but large majority will actually suffer more. So the quality of life of the country overall may have gone down, even though the economic numbers have gone up. Let me give you another example. Let's take a historical claim is made, and somebody says that this was a glorious period. So you say, okay, how did you establish? You say, look, these are the sources. This is what the evidence was. And that's one kind of judgment that we discuss. But then you may ask, so in this glorious period, what was happening to peasants? What was happening to, if there were slaves, how were they treated? What was happening to women? Was there some freedom to people, or it was a dictatorial rule? Whatever growth that was happening, how was it consumed and distributed? The moment you start to ask these questions, often the numbers start to look differently. I'll give you a very a recent example because I'm just going through that book. Often, and I think many of us may have grown up like this, although this has changed in the last 30, 40 years quite a bit. When one talks about American history, you remember the standard was Columbus discovered America. And the entire history was presented. There were sources, there was all those things, but it was presented as if there was no civilization and culture there before the Europeans came. And Europeans brought all the culture and civilization and all the sciences and everything. And look where the country is. And it was a discovery narrative. But then history and anthropology and archaeology showed again and again that there were complexities. There were millions of people who were already living there. They had discovered America much before Columbus. And so people started to look at that. And then histories were written from another perspective, not necessarily from the perspective of Europeans who had conquered, but from the perspective of those who were conquered. And when you look at it that way, perspective changed because you realize that all these glories that you were talking about were built on genocides, were built on destruction, were built on the total annihilation of populations that happened. And today, as a result, those people who were there and were in many millions are living in reservations and are living in very different conditions. Um, so that is the questions from justice. Whose voice? You look at a textbook. Let's suppose there are Urdu textbooks, and you have 25 or 30 essays and poems there. So one question would be asked, how was it created? Who was involved? And whether the policies were followed or not, and all of those kinds of things. But then you can ask, who is included, who is not included? Uh, how many pieces from women are there? Whether the country, if it's a national, whether the country overall is represented or not. You can ask whether these are the values that are given, are these the values that are progressive or conservative? You can ask whether, although Hali and Iqbal are there, but is Manto there? Is Machuktai there? You can ask those kinds of questions. So that becomes a very different way of being critical. So coming back to your question, to be critical, to think critically, is to make judgment. Judgment about the authenticity, the source, the logical conclusions. That's one type of being critical. And the other is to raise questions of who benefits, who is included, who is not, the questions of justice, fairness, and equity. And in my view, a good critical thinking process will have both of these things together. And that is when it's done, you have a very holistic approach to critical thinking.
Okay, wonderful, Dr. Farid. You have quite holistically explained this idea of critical thinking, talking about source, linking it with the authenticity, talking about who has been benefited. All right, is if we're particularly talking about giving that example of Columbus discovered America, there has been no civilization before, but there has been a civilization. So that's changed your perspective. So being critical is actually you question things that are in your surroundings and you question them according to a set standard. So you assess them and then you build your perspective. And then you have a new ideology. Maybe you might agree or disagree with the statement that is being presented to you. Okay, wonderful. So linking that to the classroom practice, how teachers can use critical thinking to promote healthy activity in classroom and to encourage students to think out of the box because they have to build their point of view. And often the design assessment also, which are based on critical thinking. But how that can we practice this inside the classrooms as a form of a formative assessment?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is to recognize that human beings and our minds have the thinking capacity from the beginning. The curiosity is there, And what we would call even critical thinking is always already there. If you meet a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, you would find them asking critical question like why, and they can continue to ask why many times until they are satisfied. So the building blocks of critical thinking are already there. Nature has provided them. And the best thing that one can do is not to crush it, not to let it die, uh, and let the question continue, engagement continue, conversations continue. And I think it's like, जब आप एक केक होता है ना, केक के ऊपर आप मोमबत्ती लगाते हैं, and then you bring the fire to it. Yeah? Now, the potential of fire is there in the mombatti already.
बिल्कुल.
आप जब उसके पास लेके जाते हैं, अगर आप वो फायर को थोड़ी देर रखते हैं, तो दैट थिंग मोमबत्ती खुद ही उसको कैप्चर कर लेती है, एंड देन इट ग्लोज ऑन इट्स ओन. And if you don't, then it doesn't catch the fire.
Yeah.
And if you, of course, extinguish it, it extinguishes. So it's like that. The potential is there. If you just allow it to flourish for some time, it will catch its own roots, and then the child will always be critical in that sense. And the roots of criticality, creativity are also, if you can't be critical, it's very hard, because unless you see the insufficiencies, you see the need for change, unless you see that something is not working out, there is no motivation for creativity as well. So the two are very strongly linked. So the first thing I think every teacher should do is recognize that these 20 kids, 30 kids, whatever the number, already have critical. It may have been suppressed, it may have been a little bit overshadowed, but it is there. So you don't have to inculcate critical thinking, you have to let it grow. Now, how do you do it? There are different subjects can do it very differently. I think, first of all, the teacher himself or herself being able to ask good questions is a very important, because that's modeling. You ask the right kind of questions, and the students gradually catch those questions. So, for example, you are reading about, let's say you are reading about, in fact, I sat in a session, and there was a topic. Topic was the Arab child, Arabic bacha, Arab bacha. That was the topic of the essay. And what the teacher did was, she did something wonderful, which that's why I want to quote it. Instead of jumping into the lesson and reading, she asked, has any of you have been to Arab countries and have met any Arab child? तो 2-3 बच्चे निकल आए, उन्होंने कहा जी हम तो मिले, हमारा दोस्त था, एक बच्चे ने अपनी प्राइमरी स्कूलिंग वहां की थी. तो दे ऑल टॉक्ड अबाउट इट. वंडरफुल सेटिंग. Now when they looked at the text, अब टेक्स्ट में ये था कि they had taken an imaginary child जो रेगिस्तान में रहता था और खेमे में रहता था, उसको लेकर आए. Now because the teacher had already discussed the gap between the experience of the students and what was in the text was creating a dissonance. और बच्चों ने रिजेक्ट कर दिया. इन्होंने कहा ये तो ठीक नहीं, हम तो और बच्चों को मिल चुके. You see, they became critical of the text automatically because their own experience was not matching with it. So I think अगर हम क्लासरूम के अंदर टेक्स्ट को डोमिनेट करने के बजाय रियल लाइफ को लेकर आए, so you would often find the children's own experience will give them the confidence to raise critical questions about the texts that are. That's one. Second, कुछ चीजों में आपको उनको हैंड होल्डिंग भी करनी पड़ेगी, सिखाना भी. मिसाल के तौर पे there are many textbooks, अभी थोड़ी बेहतर हो गए, लेकिन पुराने textbooks में there used to be pictures of home, house, different kinds of things. And you would find that women were shown and girls were shown in certain roles and men were shown. One thing is you just let it be. The other is the teacher actually guides the students to say, look, is this how you see in your house? Is this how should it be? And you start to look at it. And I think the third very important element is that when the child is attempting to be critical, one has to encourage it. One has to appreciate, even if it's a half-hearted attempt, even if it's not a very sophisticated attempt. Because our neurons start to form in the directions in which people respond to us. So when the teacher responds in a positive and encouraging manner, the neuron connections that are useful for critical thinking become stronger. And, and then gradually over time, you will see that the teacher, that the students will become more critical. So there has to be a space for making mistakes. No question is a stupid question. And I think one has to go with that. And one has to encourage. Of course, assessment and examination, the kind of questions you would formulate, uh, become very important. And that also shapes how the students would react. Let me give you one example that you can use at a higher level. Um, and I touched upon it earlier as well. There are often reports that come out about the world, about the climate, about gender, about equity. So recently there was a report which told us that um, in the world, the wealth of the world is distributed such a way that the richest 1% have 43% of the wealth, and the richest 10% have 75% of the wealth. That leaves only 20%, 24% of the wealth for the 90% of the people. And eventually, the report said that 50%, the bottom half of the humanity, has only 2% of the wealth. Now, sometimes these kind of figures can be used in the class, and especially in class 9, 10, 11, 12. If you're teaching economics, if you're teaching even Pakistan studies, you are teaching social studies, you can bring things and then you can ask, what kind of world is this? What happens when so much wealth is concentrated in few people's hands? What is the consequence for society? And you will see that very soon students will be able to work. So in short, coming to your question again, I think the first is the teachers and parents own attitude towards critical thinking and the recognition that students already have critical thought that needs to be nurtured. Second, sometimes, many times, hand holding will have to be done where teachers can ask. And if they keep in mind, there are two types of things we need to do. We need to establish the authenticity, but we also need to ask deeper questions. So हिस्ट्री पढ़ाते हुए आप जब आपने पढ़ाया कोई भी दौर, मुगलिया दौर पढ़ाया आपने, उस्मानिया दौर पढ़ाया, आप एक दफा भी ये करेंगे तो बच्चे फिर करते रहेंगे कि देखो ये तो तारीख बादशाहों की थी, एक बादशाह आया, दूसरा गया, वजीर आया, आम लोग कहाँ हैं इसके अंदर, औरतें कहाँ हैं इसके अंदर, बच्चे कहाँ हैं इसके अंदर, किसान कहाँ हैं इसके अंदर. The moment आप ये सवालात रेज करेंगे, you will see that students will be able to see and ask different. अब उसके बाद वो ये questions आगे भी पूछते रहेंगे. So ये, and third, I think encouragement, positive encouragement towards good questions and any kind of question, and you will see that when as the students will get that confidence, they will. और घर पे भी ये कर सकते हैं. I mean ये सारी चीजें घर पे भी कर सकते हैं. न्यूज़ चल रही है, न्यूज़ से कोई बात हो सकती है. कभी कभी बच्चा उस न्यूज़ पे जो आ रहा है या न्यूज़पेपर में जो नजर आ रहा है उससे अलग बात कर रहा है. हाउ डू वी रिएक्ट? डू वी से नहीं उसी को बात मानना है, या आप उसकी उस बात को लेके आगे चलते हैं? सो आई थिंक वो जो कनेक्शन है वो बढ़ सकता है, एंड जो नेचुरल बच्चे के अंदर एक क्रिटिकल थॉट है उसको हम बाहर ला सकते हैं.
True, Dr. Farid, I would like to quote that to I was reading a novel with my son. He's just 6 years old, and there's a book that is being read in the school, Animal Trickster. It's by Candy Gorley, and this is a very beautiful book. There's a story of animals, how do they trick each other, and then there's a moral lesson to it. And I mean, I read that book before, but when I was reading it with my son, he said there's a story about Mr. and Mrs. Hare. And Mr. Hare says, Mrs. Hare said, my husband, my dear husband, you're the strongest in the jungle. And Mr. Hare said, yes, I know, and I will prove that I'm the strongest one. And then he goes around and he tricks the elephant and hippopotamus. And Mrs. Hare gives him a challenge by sundown, you have to clear the entire jungle. My son, who's just 6 years old, and he said, Baba, Mr. Hare is deceiving his wife. I said, oh, I never thought this way. And he said, and on top of that, I think the demand from Mrs. here was not good even. Why is she deforesting everything? See, the books those were written maybe 40 or 50 years ago, yes, that has to, there are few books which establish a connection with the current changes. Since he's being taught in school about the climate change, in his play group, in his nursery, in his kindergarten, and now he had that in mind, and he posed those both questions to me, and I was happy. I said, very nice. And then recently we had that Eid, तो वो तलावत सुन रहा था, उस पे आया था कि अल्लाह को आपका खून और आपका गोश्त नहीं चाहिए, आपको आपकी परहेजगारी चाहिए। और मेरे बच्चे ने पूछा, तुराब अली, हिज नेम इज तुराब अली, एंड ही आस्क्ड मी कि बाबा ये परहेजगारी क्या होती है, ही बिकॉज दिस इज एन एब्स्ट्रैक्ट आइडिया। See, so it's a very important that as a parent, you entertain that question, like you mentioned, that the curiosity is inbuilt. It's
Inbuilt.
innate ability of a human being, all right, and they want to seek knowledge, and then that it was very difficult for me to explain him that abstract idea of Prahesgari.
Yes. I mean, our own critical capacities would increase if we engage with children. मैं
Yeah,
आपके उस एग्जाम्पल पे अगर 1 मिनट के लिए, आधे मिनट के लिए वापस
please,
जाऊं, वो जो
please.
एनवायरनमेंट वाला, जो डिफॉरेस्टेशन की आपने बात की,
Uh,
अब दैट्स एग्जैक्टली व्हाट वाज हैपनिंग. Your child had certain value in mind, the
yes,
value of the forest and greenery.
yeah,
And therefore, when he read something, heard something that was going against it, the mind was immediately was able to be critical,
yeah.
because there was a standard, there was a value that he was able to. So अगर आप बच्चों को इक्विटी, फेयरनेस, जस्टिस,
Hmm.
ट्रुथ, ऑनेस्टी, ये वैल्यूज के साथ बड़ा करेंगे, तो यू विल सी कि इन वैल्यूज को यूज करके दे विल बी क्रिटिकल ऑफ द टेक्स्ट, ऑफ द प्रैक्टिस, ऑफ द सोसाइटी, क्योंकि दैट्स व्हाट दे वुड हैव लर्नड.
Yeah, that's true, sir. Right. So there are certain misconceptions about critical thinking. When it is being um, taught in training rooms to teachers. ठीक है? So teachers somehow they feel कि अगर if we encourage critical thinking, ठीक है, तो हमारी क्लास रूम कंट्रोल खराब हो जाएगा। ठीक है, हमारी क्लास मैनेजमेंट पे बहुत ज्यादा क्वेश्चंस आएंगे, विल नॉट बी एबल टू अचीव और आउटकम्स विद इन द टाइम फ्रेम। ठीक है, और वी विल बी देयर विल बी लॉट ऑफ एक्टिविटी हैपनिंग इन द क्लासरूम, तो हमारी डायरेक्शंस जो है ना लेसन्स की, वो लेफ्ट राइट हो जाएंगी, विल नॉट बी एबल टू अचीव द आउटकम्स विद इन द required within the limited time. So how can we address these very issues which are existing? So I want to take help from you in that regard. Ji.
बिल्कुल ठीक है. I mean these are real issues that teachers
Yeah.
face. Let's start with that it is, and it is possible that what you and I will discuss will not satisfy everybody, but we can just throw some ideas.
Yes.
पहली चीज तो ये कि मुझे अक्सर लगता है कि वन ऑफ द मिसकंसेप्शंस अबाउट क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग, इट्स नॉट जस्ट एट द लेवल ऑफ स्कूल बट अक्रॉस द बोर्ड. मैं देखता हूँ यूनिवर्सिटीज में भी, जो इंटरनेशनल इदारे हैं, यूनिसेफ, वर्ल्ड बैंक, इनमें भी, they only restrict critical thinking to the first thing that we mentioned, assessment of sources and data, and to to protect the person from being misled. फेक न्यूज़ की बातें होती हैं कि हाउ डू यू एस्टेब्लिश कि जो सोशल मीडिया पे पड़ा है वो फेक नहीं है. That's half the story. So first thing I would say is, the first misconception is that that half thing is considered as the whole critical thought. मगर उसको whole करने के लिए actually you have to bring the social justice part and equity part that we discussed. That's the first thing, that our understanding of critical thinking itself needs to be varied and larger. I think it is true. The time is a constraint, particularly in higher classes because there are exams. वहाँ आइडियली तो ये होना चाहिए कि एग्जाम्स खुद चेंज होने चाहिए. मुझे कभी ज़्यादा ये भी नहीं समझ आया कि ये एग्जाम्स होते क्यों हैं, पर चलें वो हम करते हैं एग्जाम, तो उसकी नौयत. बट छोटी क्लासेस में ना स्कूल्स के पास ज़्यादा फ्रीडम है. देयर इज़ नो नीड to cover everything that is there. You actually aim to cover what it can be covered. And the fundamental question becomes not just at the school teacher. Teacher कई दफ़ा is restricted because of the larger school policies. So I would think about head teachers and principals and others. We should ask, what is the purpose of education? If the purpose of education is to build mind and create thought and empathy and care, then it has no link with how much is covered, whether you teach 20 essays and 10 poems or you teach only 5, because एक से भी ये चीजें नर्चर हो सकती हैं। एंड देखिए ना, आप कितना भी बड़ा करिकुलम बना ले, सारी चीजें तो कवर नहीं करेंगे ना। आई मीन, you if you have history, you will have to choose. So whether you choose this much or you choose this much, ultimately the world out is infinite in a way. Why not choose little but do well? So I think जहां पर ये freedom available है, I would suggest that the teachers and head teachers should work on that. ये जो कंसर्न है कि जी यस, क्लासेस थोड़ी सी डिस्टर्ब होंगी, बट उसी में वो बच्चा ज्यादा सीख रहा होगा, उसी में, क्योंकि दैट इज ऑल्सो अ साइन ऑफ एंगेजमेंट। यू सी, अगर अब आपको वो फिल्म बहुत अच्छी तरह से पता है, डेड पोएट सोसाइटी, उसमें यही दो विजन है ना। पोइट्री को आप इस तरह पढ़ा सकते हैं कि सारी चीजें डिसिप्लिन्ड है, और हर बच्चा अपने टाइम पे बोल रहा है और बात आगे चल रही है, आप पढ़ रहे हैं टेक्स्ट बुक, और दैट्स व्हाट। एंड देन दिस न्यू टीचर कम्स इन, इज अ डिफरेंट अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ व्हाट लर्निंग इज, एंड ही सेज दैट लुक, ये जो एंगेजमेंट है जिसमें आप एक दूसरे से बात कर रहे हैं, आप एनर्जाइज हो गए हैं, आप, दैट इज व्हाट रियली मेक्स यू थिंक, क्योंकि आपके अंदर एक इसकी वजह से आपको एक जॉय भी मिल रहा है और आपको एक खुशी भी मिल रही। सो आई थिंक कि इसको, जो ये क्लासरूम में जिसको हम डिसरप्शन समझते हैं, ऑफन दैट इज द रूट थ्रू विच एक एंगेजमेंट क्लासरूम के अंदर आती है। लास्ट चीज जो मैं कहूँगा वो ये, विच ऑल्सो सम टीचर्स वुड से, कि जब आप क्रिटिकल थॉट क्रिएट करते हैं, जब आप इन्वायरमेंट को लेके, जेंडर को लेके, वेल्थ को लेके, पॉलिटिक्स को लेके, यू कैन ऑल्सो क्रिएट डिप्रेशन, बिकॉज लोग कहेंगे यार ये तो सब चीजें ही देखो यार, क्या हम करते हैं आपस में, जब पाकिस्तान की पॉलिटिक्स की बात करते हैं कई दफा ये करते हैं, कुछ भी नहीं चल रहा, क्या फायदा है ना। ये एक और मिसकंसेप्शन है। मुझे लगता है जो जेन्यून क्रिटिकल थॉट है उसको सिर्फ क्रिटिकल नहीं रहना चाहिए, और उसके साथ होप भी क्रिएट करनी चाहिए। एंड दैट्स वेयर we can bring examples from the history and from our own society where individuals are making difference, छोटा बड़ा। हिस्टोरिकली कितनी सारी चीजें जो प्रॉब्लमेटिक थी वो चेंज हो गई हैं। आज हम अगर स्लेवरी को ही ले लें, ऑल्दो देयर आर अदर फॉर्म्स ऑफ स्लेवरी, लेकिन वो जो लीगलिस्टिक स्लेवरी थी वो वी मैनेज टू एंड। खवातीन एंड मर्द की इक्वालिटी आज भी एक ख्वाब ज्यादा है हकीकत से, लेकिन वो हकीकत कई ज्यादा तल्ख थी और कुछ इलाकों में आज भी। सो वी डू मूव फॉरवर्ड मॉरली, और आई थिंक वो बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट है कि हम स्टूडेंट्स को ये भी कहें कि व्हेन यू डू क्रिटिक, इट्स नॉट टू बी डिप्रेस्ड, बट इट इज टू बी होपफुल दैट हियर इज योर अपॉर्चुनिटी टू मेक अ डिफरेंस। आप मिलके कुछ कर सकते हैं, आप अपनी जिंदगी के करियर ऐसे चूज कर सकते हैं कि आप कहें कि ये मैंने चीज नोट की। आई देर आर आई मेट फ्यू पीपल हु टोल्ड मी दैट उनके अपने घर में कुछ बीमारी कभी थी, एंड दे सॉ द सफरिंग, एंड दैट मोटिवेटेड देम टू चूज द करियर्स, कि लुक, आई विल डू समथिंग टू हेल्प पीपल एंड सफर लेस एंड फाइंड सम क्योर्स। सो कई दफा ये जो क्रिटिकल थॉट है ना, ये आपको जिंदगी में मीनिंग भी दे सकता है कि look, there is something to be done and I will do something more than for my own life and my own self. तो आई थिंक ये, और आखिरी चीज मैं ये कहूंगा, मैं कई दफा ये सोचता था कि एक किताब होनी चाहिए जिसका नाम होना चाहिए टीचिंग एज अ सबवर्शन, टीचिंग एज सबवर्शन। इत्तेफाक से वो किताब है 1979 की, नील पोस्टमैन की, टीचिंग एज सबवर्सिव एक्टिविटी। In some ways, a good teacher is also a subversive teacher in the sense कि अगर करिकुलम में या स्कूल के अंदर क्रिटिकल थॉट के बजाय कंफॉर्मिटी सिखाई जाती है, उसको प्रेफर किया जाता है, आप बच्चों को कैद करते हैं उनकी सोच को, तो एक अच्छा टीचर जो होता है वो कोशिश करता है कि मैं इसको अंडरमाइन करूं, इसको सबवर्ट करूं, बाय ब्रिंगिंग इन समथिंग डिफरेंट। अगर करिकुलम में कुछ नहीं है तो आप करिकुलम को इनरिच कर सकते हैं, कोई वीडियो दिखा सकते हैं, आप कोई एक पोएम कहीं और से ला सकते हैं, कोई ऐसे कोई और ला सकते हैं। और तो आई थिंक अगर टीचर के लिए अपने लिए क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग की एक वैल्यू है, तो वो यकीनन कोई ना कोई तरीका क्लासरूम में ढूंढ सकता है कि कैसे उसके स्पार्क। और मैं आपको बताऊं, एक सवाल और एक दफा ही चाहिए होता है कि बच्चे का माइंड उस तरह सोचना शुरू कर देता है। यू डोंट नीड कि हर लेसन के अंदर क्रिटिकल थॉट। किसी एक जगह भी आपने पूछ लिया कि देखें इसमें सारे तस्वीर, आप अभी एक तस्वीर आई थी जो चाइना में जब ट्रंप गया था। सो देयर वाज अ पिक्चर ऑफ दीज टू साइड सिटिंग अक्रॉस ईच अदर। तकरीबन 30 लोग बैठे हुए थे, ट्रंप की तरफ और इस तरफ भी। एंड यू सो दोस 30 मोस्ट पावरफुल people in the world, America and China, not a single woman. All of them were. It's a great opportunity for a teacher to bring that to the classroom and say, okay, look, what do you think of that? Why is this? And that's it. You can then go back to your lesson and do, but you have created a spark. And that will raise some questions and some thought. तो छोटी छोटी चीजें भी की जा सकती हैं. You don't have to devote the whole period
Yeah.
on this. Just one spark here, one question there, one comment here, and that can have a lasting impact.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. I really like that how Dr. Farid, you have consolidated the entire idea. Starting from defining, giving a perspective to critical thinking, and then last ending on hope. Yes, we need
Mm.
to ignite that hope. You are very much right. At times with the critical thinking comes a lot of depression because when
Yes.
you're looking at each and everything critically, then you get depressed. कि ये सब खराब ही क्यों है, अच्छा क्यों नहीं है, अच्छा हो सकता कैसे है, तो सोचता है इंसान, लेकिन फिर ओ आई डोंट हैव द कैपेसिटी टू अनडू लॉट्स ऑफ थिंग्स। ठीक है, तो लेकिन लुकिंग एट द एग्जांपल्स, ठीक है, वी टॉक अबाउट जेंडर इक्वालिटी, अभी भी बहुत ज्यादा अचीवमेंट्स करने की जरूरत है, लेकिन फिर भी थिंग्स हैव इम्प्रूव। सो विद दैट आई वुड लाइक टू थैंक यू डॉक्टर फरीद फॉर योर टाइम।
एक चीज और कह सकता हूँ भाई, लास्ट
श्योर
जस्ट
श्योर
हाफ।
प्लीज।
देखिए, आपने क्रिटिकली किसी चीज को इवेल्युएट कर लिया, किसी प्रैक्टिस को इवेल्युएट कर लिया। नाउ हाउ डू यू गिव दैट क्रिटिक? कैसे देते हैं? ये भी बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट। एक हो सकता है कि आप क्रिटिक करें, एक किसी की आपने ऐसे पढ़ा और आपको वो लगा कि उसमें बहुत सारे मसले हैं, आपने कोई टीवी का जो भी चीज़ आपने न्यूज़, अब आप उसको बताएंगे कैसे कि भाई ये मसले थे। एक ये हो सकता है कि आप अपनी क्रिटिक को एक विप की तरह यूज करें और उसको उसकी पिटाई करें कि तुमने ये भी नहीं किया, तुम्हें ये भी नहीं आया। और कई लोग ये भी करते हैं। मगर यहां पर एक और रोल आता है, गिविंग क्रिटिक विद काइंडनेस, कि आप उसको मौका देखें कि दिस इज एन अपॉर्चुनिटी फॉर मी टू टीच समथिंग टू समबडी हु मे नॉट हैव द सेम अपॉर्चुनिटीज दैट आई हैड। और आप उसको मेहरबानी के साथ, एक काइंडनेस के साथ, एक अच्छे तरीके से उसको आप करते हैं कि देखो ये चीज़ ठीक थी, ये ठीक नहीं था। एंड यू विल सी कि दैट फीडबैक जो काइंडनेस के साथ दिया जाता है ना, उसका असर बड़ा ज़्यादा रहता है। वो बच्चा या बड़ा भी फील कर लेता है कि ये फीडबैक आ रहा है मुझे नीचा करने के लिए, या ये आ रहा है मुझे डेवलप करने के लिए। सो आई वुड ऐड काइंडनेस टू होप alongside the critical thinking.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Farid, for your time. We really appreciate. Jazakallah. See you
Thank you.
inshallah some other day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.